All right, good morning, everybody. Steve Berg from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I'm very happy to be here. I'm grateful to the Congressman and his staff for having me out here. My mother was born right near Stevens Point, so even though most of my career has been on one coast or another, I feel a certain affinity to this part of the country, and even the cold weather was not too much. Because today is a warm day, right? Okay, so what I want to talk about, I want to talk a little bit about, why homelessness, why anybody cares about that, and then talk some more about, given that they do, and I'll conclude that they do, what people are doing about it and what the results of that are, because I think this is an exciting time to be working on this issue, because I think the level of know-how has increased to the point where when we talk about, we're the National Alliance to End Homelessness. That's been our name for a long time, and that is our goal, what we're trying to do. And I think right now, more than any other time in my career, I feel like that's a doable goal, and I'm hoping that you'll walk out of here feeling the same way. So a lot of people ask me in this period of political conflict and strife and recession and everything else, does anybody really care about something like homelessness? My answer is, going all over the country, talking to all kinds of different people, all kinds of different political persuasions and everything else, is yes, people do care. They have all kinds of different reasons for caring, but maybe more than any other issue, Americans are deeply troubled by the fact that a certain percentage of the population is living on the streets, living in shelters, for different reasons. I mean, one is just when you look at the kinds of people who become homeless. If you look at the list of groups who are overrepresented among the homeless population, to put it in sort of a wonky kind of way, it's people that I think most Americans would think these are people who need some extra help or particularly vulnerable. People with severe mental illness, of course, are extremely overrepresented among the homeless population. So when you're a homeless policy person like me, you get to know something about mental illness, how it affects families, how debilitating it is, how serious and long-term a disability that is. Many people don't know much about mental illness. They think, they somehow think if people would just sort of work at it, they could transcend that. But then you run into people in all walks of life who have a family member, or who have a spouse, or who have a close friend who has schizophrenia or another severe mental illness, and whatever their other politics are like, or whatever else they believe is the case, they understand that this is a serious disease and a long-term disability and has to be dealt with. And yet, many, many people with mental illness are sleeping in doorways and eating out of trash cans. Most Americans, I think we can do better than that. Another group that's overrepresented is young children. The age in an American's life, the 1 year in an American's life where that American is most likely to be homeless, is the year between age 0 and age 1. And the second, third, and fourth years are the next 3 years in that person's life. This has lasting impacts on young people. The sort of constant beating down that being homeless involves is a trauma that kids live with for years and years. I'm constantly having people come up to me, people my age, who still remember the time when they were a little kid, when they spent a year or spent 2 years homeless, and it still haunts them throughout their whole lives. This is a group, kids didn't ask for this, and they need some help. In the last few years, we've seen more and more people who are homeless who are just sort of swept up in the economic crisis we had in this country. That was a product of long-term changes in the economy and some sort of bad behavior on the part of various moneyed interests in New York City. If I start talking about this, you'll quickly see that I don't understand the details of what causes financial crisis, but we see the results of it, and people who thought they had, who were playing by the rules, had worked all their lives, and all of a sudden there is no job to be had, and they're ending up homeless. Veterans is another group. Veterans of military service, for whatever reason, are overrepresented among the homeless population. I'll come back and talk about veterans a little bit at the end of my remarks, but this is a group who we I think, have a special responsibility to. But because of again, for reasons not everybody understands that well, but have at least something to do with people's experience, at least in the last several years, of going into combat and what that's like, end up on the streets, end up in shelters with no way to get out of that situation. People care about homelessness because even though there's a lot of dispute about poverty in this country and sort of who's at fault and how much individual responsibility the person has, when it gets to the point of homelessness, when people get to the point of homelessness, I think there's a broad agreement that that's too much. That's too much. That's too much suffering. That's too much alienation from the mainstream of our communities for anybody to deserve. And so, and even if as an ethical point that there's some disagreement about that, I think many people agree that just as a practical matter, even people who very much believe that people are responsible for the results of their own behavior. If people are poor, that's primarily their responsibility. A lot of people believe that, a lot of Americans believe that, but again, when it gets to the point where they're homeless, as a practical matter, I think many people would agree that the barriers to sort of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and getting yourself back into work and back into mainstream society, the barriers that you face when you're homeless are so severe that people need some kind of boost. If they get a little boost out of that situation, then they can take care of the rest of the problems themselves, but that barrier of homelessness is too much. Why else do people care? There's sort of more practical reasons. There's a big cost to homelessness. Homelessness costs taxpayers a lot of money. I mean, it's really quite striking. The piece of research that I think in Washington, D.C. had the biggest impact and really I think was responsible for getting the Bush administration interested in doing a lot more about homelessness was research of this guy named Dennis Culhane, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Got a bunch of data from a couple of big cities where the data existed and found that people with severe mental illness who were living on the streets were costing taxpayers $45,000 or $50,000 a year on average in emergency mental health treatment, in jails and prisons, in law enforcement, in shelters. You can do a lot for somebody with $45,000 or $50,000 a year, even in New York City, I'll tell you. That's just sort of the average. And then if you go to this sort of anecdotal results, the Malcolm Gladwell piece a few years ago about $1 Million Murray, someone in the state of Nevada, who literally cost the taxpayers of Nevada $1 million because he was homeless, and the constant use of these expensive emergency systems. And then the same researcher found that if you take the same people and house them and give them a little bit of supportive services, well, with that group it's probably quite a bit of supportive services, but still, you can do that for less money than it was costing the taxpayers, because when people got into housing, they stopped going to the emergency room. They stopped going to jail. They, of course, stopped going to homeless shelters. So the cost of homelessness and the savings that can be achieved by solving homelessness have become more and more apparent to people who have been backed up by good solid research. I think even beyond the sort of financial costs, I think people understand that there's it's hard to know exactly how to talk about this, but I talk about it as sort of a spiritual cost to homelessness in terms of people's understanding of the well-being of their communities. It's hard to think about your community as a good, safe, solid, good place for kids to grow up when you look around and there's people living on the streets of different communities and living in homeless shelters and living in their cars. So I think all those things are reasons people care about homelessness, and in fact, the upshot of all that, they're really, when you talk to people, for the vast majority of Americans, there's not really any dispute about whether homelessness is a problem worth solving. I mean, we've done polling on this, we talked to lots of people, and really when it comes right down to it, people agree that this would be a good and worthwhile thing to do. The problem with homelessness is that there has been a sense of complete hopelessness that we can actually do something, that we actually can do something productive that will really solve the problem. The sort of epidemic of modern American homelessness, as we call it, began in the 1980s, very severe recession, and a lot of people lost their jobs. People ended up becoming homeless. But unlike other times in the 20th century, when the economy improved, the homeless situation didn't improve. So that was in the mid-90s because of a whole bunch of different changes that were happening in the housing market and changes that were happening in the employment market. Homelessness kept going up even as the economy improved and became sort of a constant thing. So now we've had, that was 80 years ago, and now we've had a whole generation, more than a generation of people come of age with the idea that homelessness is just sort of part of the landscape in the United States of America. And that sort of breeds an acceptance and an idea that you can't do anything about it. And in some ways, this idea that this is a problem we can't do anything about, that's become so ingrained, that's sort of the biggest mystery to me of all. I mean, in this country, in the United States of America, the problem of homelessness, when you really look at it, it's not so huge. I mean, the point in time count in Wausau, the count of homeless people was like 108. 108 is a big chunk of people for a city the size of Wausau, but it's not that many people. There's 108 people who need to get housed over the course of a year. There's probably, it comes about 3 times that many people become homeless over the course of the year. This is not a huge problem in a country that has solved other kinds of gigantic problems. So, given that, it's not surprising to me that over the years, over the last 10 years or so, as people have approached this problem more, and really starting with the Bush administration, if there's a starting point to it, I would say that when the Bush administration announced its first budget in the early 2000s and said we're going to end chronic homelessness, that people around the country have come up with the idea that yes, there is a practical solution, and it's that this sense of the new sense of practicality to this that is mainly what I want to talk about. It's really about know-how. I mean, as communities have decided that this is what they want to do, tried out different things, the understanding of what it's going to take to solve this problem has grown tremendously in a number of different ways. Which I'll go into in a little bit of detail. But the first thing I want to say about this is to the extent there's a new approach to homelessness, and not that new anymore, but sort of in the last 10 years, it's grown a lot. This is not, just a couple of things about this. One, this is not something that HUD sort of decided on and is telling everybody to do. The HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development in the US government, who funds a lot of homelessness programs. This is something that local communities, driven by all the people who have to deal with homelessness on a daily basis. I'm not just talking about homeless providers, I'm talking about a lot of other people too, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it's an effort that's really been driven by local communities saying, can't we do something better than what we've done in the past? Do we have to accept homelessness as a given in our community? Or can we do something better? Now, I don't want to sort of downplay the importance of these HUD programs. The part of HUD that oversees the homelessness program is staffed by people I think are remarkable public servants. These are, not all of the federal government is like this, but one of the nice things about working on homelessness on the national level is the biggest funder of homeless programs in the federal government is an exceptional part of that organization with really good sort of career people who are deeply committed to making this work and and really helping communities. So it's not just passing out the money, it's trying to help too. But they know, one of the things that makes them so good is they know they're not going to figure it all out for themselves. They, like us, are looking at what communities are doing, trying to figure out who's getting good results, talking to people a lot about how they're doing it, and then sharing that information with others. So it's not, this is very much a bottom-up kind of approach, the new approach to homelessness that I'm talking about. So I want to talk about three sort of main components to what what communities who've been getting good results with homelessness, what they've been doing. The first part of it is just a basic understanding of what it is they're trying to accomplish. And I would summarize that by saying that communities are trying to move beyond just managing the problem of homelessness and get to a point where they're solving the problem of homelessness. When homelessness sort of arose in the 1980s, I think people's first response was, well, we got to have shelter and we got to keep people from disrupting the orderly operation of the community. And it was really about managing the problem, trying to avoid the worst impacts of homelessness. And people have been doing that for a long time now, and it's expensive and it doesn't work very well. So I think when people thought about what we could do better, the really what they've come down to in communities where this has worked, it's really come down to a much more solutions-oriented approach. Everything is thought about, every decision that's made and is thought about in terms of, is this going to bring the number of homeless people down or is it not? And if it's not, then there's probably not a good reason to be doing it because there's never enough money so we should be doing things that are going to bring the number of homeless people down. So the real question people are asking themselves is, if we want to really solve the problem, so what does it take? What does it take to have a homeless person not be homeless anymore, to be housed? And this sounds very obvious, but it's a question that wasn't at the basis of what people were doing. So it was a question people are asking themselves much more. And the conclusion people came up with, and I think this is probably true here like it is everywhere else, is a whole range of different people are homeless. Homeless people are not all the same. And in terms of sort of how you're going to figure out what the solution is, the important thing is homeless people range from very, very sick people with long-term, very severe disabilities many of whom have been on the streets for years and years. That's sort of one end of the spectrum. And what they're going to need to not be homeless anymore is one kind of program. But then most people who become homeless, especially now in a period of high unemployment, are people who don't have what you would call disabilities. They just are having an economic crisis. They have had a personal crisis that's about money, about being able to afford rent. Lost their job, other family members lost their jobs too, so they can't afford housing, and they end up in a shelter, they end up in their car, they end up on the streets. That is a much larger group of people, frankly. The people who become homeless due to those sorts of economic crises is a much larger group than the very severely ill group. And what they need to not be homeless anymore turns out to be a very different kind of programming, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's just, that's the understanding that a lot of the communities have come to, is really thinking about who is homeless and what are their needs and what's it going to take for them not to be homeless anymore. Overall, the answer to the question, what's it going to take for families, for people not to be homeless anymore, is for most homeless people, maybe not as much as you would think. I mean, I think a lot of people, when they think what's it going to take for a homeless person not to be homeless anymore, they think, well, it's going to be very expensive, it's going to cost a lot of money, we can't do it. But this is where the way of thinking about and focusing on solving the problem of homelessness becomes very important. Because a lot of people who are homeless, they have all kinds of problems. Somebody who's comes from a more middle class or better kind of experience would look at a typical homeless family and say they have all kinds of problems. And many of them do have all kinds of problems. problems, things that are going to be things that they're going to struggle with for a long time. But if the goal is to end homelessness, then rather than saying, can we solve all their problems, to end homelessness, the important thing is to say, what is it going to take to get this person to not be homeless anymore? Now, this is a difficult thing for a lot of people because people working in the field, other people, they look at the person who comes to them and they want us, you know, someone with a lot of problems, they want us to help them with all their problems. And there's ways to do that and there's times to do it. But if you ask homeless people what their biggest problem is, their biggest problem is they don't have a place to live. That comes up over and over again. You ask the homeless people themselves what the most important thing they need to have a better life is. It's like, help me get an apartment. You get beyond that and, you know, there are other things, but there are other systems and other things to do to help with that. So if the goal is to end homelessness, it's important to think about, can I solve that most important problem for this person and then move on to the next person? Because there's lots of people waiting outside your door trying to get in and get this help. There are other problems to work on. We work on all kinds of other problems. I personally am involved in all kinds of other things. But to get good results on homelessness, that kind of focus is what's important. So that's the sort of mindset. That's one big thing communities are doing. The next big things that communities that are getting good results are doing is about the kinds of programs they're operating. And this very much arises from the question of like who's homeless and what do they need to not be homeless. So on the one hand, and longer term sort of dating back to the beginning of the Bush administration, their focus on chronic homelessness, is this idea of permanent supportive housing. This is a program model that's designed for the people on the one end of the spectrum that I talked about, who have long-term, very severe disabilities, usually behavioral health problems, usually a mental health issue, often complicated by an addiction issue, and have probably been homeless for a long time. A group of people who, when many Americans say you can't do anything about homelessness, it's because they're thinking about this person. So a couple things about that. One, well, actually the program models that are developed under the rubric of permanent supportive housing have proven themselves very effective at getting the most difficult to serve people off the streets into housing, keeping them in housing, improving their lives tremendously, and saving taxpayers a lot of money. What could be better, right? So communities that are having good results have really adopted this and really targeted it more mostly toward the people with the most severe problem. I mean, one little problem we had, like during the Bush administration, the administration asked for more money for permanent supportive housing. Congress provided more money for permanent supportive housing. But a lot of times, because the supportive services weren't in place, the people running the program shied away from serving the very most difficult to serve people. So a little easier group of clients would get to housing and the most chronically homeless people would stay on the street. I think HUD is really pushing now in its latest continuum of care application for people familiar with that. This is the I want to say big, it's the largest federal homelessness funding program at about $2 billion. Which is not big when you compare it to the whole federal budget, but it's what we got. In that program, HUD is really asking communities to, with their existing permanent housing programs, to really look more at serving the more chronically homeless population and then making help available to do that. So that's one of the program models is permanent supportive housing. Now a newer model, newer than permanent supportive housing, although hardly new anymore, is this idea of rapid rehousing, which is sort of a generic term for a typical rapid rehousing program. I would point people to the rapid exit program that started up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and this is actually the late 90s, was sort of the first experience with this approach. When they realized that it was mainly for families with kids, and they realized a lot of the homeless families with kids they were seeing, they were people who came in without a lot of severe health kinds of problems. They had a work history. They might not be working right now, but they're at least have some connection with the labor market. And rather than sort of a long-term deep subsidy, what if we just tried, if their main problem and the main disrupting force in the family's life is the fact that they don't have housing, what if we just got them housing right now, and then sort of help them figure out everything else once they were housed. So they provided, they worked with landlords carefully, because this model, rapid rehousing, requires a good relationship with landlords in the community. Made a typical subsidy would be, the moving costs, mainly just moving costs. Security deposit, first and last month's rent, whatever in that community is common for landlords who rent to sort of lower income people to get into the units. And then we had a concentrated focus by one of our social workers on helping them get a job. So it was really, the whole intervention was about 2 months long, a couple months of rent, help getting a job, or help improving their income if they already have a job. And the results were spectacular. The vast majority of people who got this intervention did get housed. They stayed housed for a long term. They did get a job. They were done with homelessness. Homelessness had become a short-term, rapid, a very short-term experience for them, rather than getting stuck in the homeless system for years like a lot of families were before. This rapid rehousing model got picked up by other communities. Columbus, Ohio was a real leader in it. Other places all around the country, and it's now, Congress made money available for demonstration projects, so there's more research showing some of the fine points of how to do it. But the upshot is that this really works, and for most homeless people, it works for an amount of money that makes it really possible to think about for this sort of not so severely disabled group, to think about providing the intervention to every single person who needs it and really ending homelessness. Now, a couple of things about both these things. As I talked about before, there's an idea here that in program design, it's about providing just enough for the person not to be homeless. I think, as I talked about before, there's a tendency to, partly arising out of all different motivations, partly out of the sort of professional responsibility of the professionals involved. I mean, as an example, I'm trained as a lawyer, and a lawyer's professional responsibility is such that if somebody is your client, you have an obligation to them to do everything you can for them. But you don't have any obligation to people waiting outside your door to get in. And I think this is true in the social work field as well. A lot of the human services professions, and just people's response to the person sort of sitting right in front of them. But I think these program models are more like, again, as I said before, get the most important thing taken care of. Do it for as little money as you can, because the less you spend on this person, the more people waiting in line outside your door you're going to be able to give this most important thing to. And it's shown in community after community that really adopt this rapid rehousing approach, that it works and gets great results. Both of these models, permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, are housing first kind of models. The phrase housing first is really about the idea that whatever people's problems are, they are easier solved when the person's housing situation is stabilized and taken care of. So this is something that communities around the country are really adopting in their homeless systems, is get the person into housing first. They're not going, whatever other kinds of problems are destabilizing their lives, it's going to be very difficult to solve those problems if they're living in a homeless shelter, not to mention if they're living on a park bench. Whether it's dealing with addiction, whether it's stabilizing a mental health condition, whether it's just getting the skills necessary to know how to apply for a job and making a convincing case to an employer. Whatever those problems are, if the housing situation is taken care of, even for a short period of time, people are much more successful at dealing with the other things that will allow them to keep their housing stabilized for a longer time. I want to say a word about homelessness prevention, because I think to really end homelessness, really the end of homelessness is going to be marked by the fact that we don't have homeless programs anymore. We have only homeless prevention programs. Most places are ways from having to worry too much about that yet. In most places, what we really need to be focusing us on is the people who are already homeless, getting them housed. But I think prevention is very important. People need to be thinking about it and figuring out how to make it work, because they're going to get to the point where that's going to be what their system is like. Like most programs to prevent most things, one of the things about a prevention program is that you're going to provide services to people who would never have had the problem if they didn't get the services. If you do a homeless prevention program, you're going to give, help with, and your homeless prevention program is help with back rent. So if you do a program like that, you are going to give back rent to people who would have figured out some way to not be homeless if you hadn't helped them. And that's okay. I mean, there's always some of that in any prevention program. I mean, we have programs in this country to prevent childhood diphtheria. What does that consist of? It consists of giving a vaccination to every single child in every school in the country. If we didn't give vaccinations, most of those kids would not get diphtheria. So you're ending up spending money on diphtheria shots for a lot of kids who they wouldn't have gotten diphtheria. The thing is, you don't know who would have gotten it and who wouldn't have. And the benefits of prevention are so great that the cost of the individual intervention is so small in that case that it makes a lot of sense both humanely and economically. With homelessness, we're not quite to that point yet. We're not in a situation where we can provide homeless prevention services to every single person who has difficulty with housing. Maybe we'll get there. We work on that. We'll get there, but we're not there yet. So people are stuck with trying to figure out who's most likely to become homeless and who's not. And that there's a lot of guesswork involved in that. People who are working on it are getting better and better at it all the time. So it's worth thinking about. I think, again, I'm going to talk about veterans in a few more minutes, and this is a place where that I think is going to take the lead in this. But for right now, I think most communities really need to concentrate more on people who are homeless now, how to get them back into housing. And if you do that, and if you do it rapidly, the kinds of things that get a person rapidly back into housing will also be good prevention things. So when you're ready to make this switch in emphasis, the systems will be set up to do it. When talking about these individual programs, I want to talk about money a little bit. I was at a session with the Homeless Coalition last night and talked a lot about money. I've always joked that, I trained as a lawyer after my first year in law school. I did an internship or a summer job with a big commercial law firm, like most of the people I was in law school with. And I found that I wasn't that interested in the work. The guys who worked in this firm, and they were all guys, who were really interested in that were people who really were fascinated with money. And they were dealing with lots of money, not necessarily their own money, but other people's money. And that's the people who really liked that. And it didn't work for me, just for whatever reason. It's nice to have, but you can do things with it, but it's not that fascinating. But then I find myself now in this job, it's like I go weeks on end where all I talk about is money. It's like, how do we get more, and how can I get Congress to put in more, and what people should spend it on. So I try not to talk about money all the time, but let me just say a word about money, because things have been tough. I know. We went through a recession where, the stock market plummeted, so a lot of sort of givers in the community suddenly didn't have as much money to give away. The federal government, of course, has been dealing with sequestration. Housing programs have been cut. People working on the continuum of care. Now, the homeless programs are being certainly going to be cut. The exact amount is not clear yet, but even the homeless programs, which Congress tries really hard to make sure there's money for them, even when there's not money for anything else, they're going to take a slight cutback this year. I want to say that I think that is bottoming out right now. I think over the next year or two, we'll be back to where we can stop, at least stop the downsizing, and there will be a little more money for some of these programs that I'm talking about. And if people want to, you can come on our website and find out lots of detail about what's going on in Congress and what some of the good funding sources are for some of these programs. But I think the idea that we can't think about doing anything new is hopefully we're past that, at least when it's something as important as this. Okay, so I talked about sort of the general general approach to the problem. I talked about individual program models that kind of work. And the third thing that communities are doing that's very important is taking a much more systemic approach to solving the problem. This is a move from having a collection of programs to having a system that ends homelessness. The communities have been really successful. This is what they do, and there's a couple of pieces to that. One is a system's got to involve a lot of people. So, communities that weren't getting such great results when they had a meeting about what to do about homelessness in the community, the people running programs for homeless people would be the ones who were there and nobody else. In the communities that are really making progress, those people are of course there, but also there are people who care about the well-being of the community in a general way. So business leaders, members of the clergy, law enforcement. They're people who care about the community in a general way, but they're also people who are dealing with the problem of homelessness. They might not think of that as their job, but law enforcement, hospitals. I talked about how expensive the people living on the street with mental illness were. Well, somebody's paying that right now, and it's probably a local hospital. So they're your friends in this idea of ending homelessness. So besides getting that whole broad range of people involved, it's important to have systems level leadership. If you want to end homelessness in the community, you have to have somebody whose job it is to every day come in and think, how close are we to ending homelessness? How much progress have we made in the last week? How are we going to take the next few steps? I mean, that person doesn't necessarily have to be somebody who's positioned to sort of tell everybody what to do and order people. But having management at the systems level that'll think about questions like what impact different programs are having. Who are the range of homeless people? What do they need to not be homeless anymore? Who's responsible for what pieces of it? How much work are they doing? What results are happening? Is there data coming in that allows us to know these things? Having people whose job it is to do that, that's important to getting results. It doesn't have to be a lot of people. It doesn't have to be some huge giant organization or think tank. But a lot of times, we've seen communities, sort of medium-sized communities, where it's like somebody in the mayor's office has been given that assignment, and if they take it seriously, then the community will make progress. And the final thing is getting everybody together to agree that these are our goals and what the pieces of this strategy are, and people have accountability to each other to get the things done that need to be done. So that's sort of the components of what I would call a systems level approach to the problem. So those three pieces, the way of thinking about the problem, using those best practice program models, and taking a systems level approach, these three things have been enacted by a lot of communities, and the results have been, sorry, I'm finding my place here. The results have been very strong. We have communities, I mentioned Columbus and Minneapolis before, places like Omaha, Nebraska has seen great results in the number of homeless people. We saw one of the great examples is in the city of Houston after Hurricane Katrina. I mean, people remember the TV coverage of that, with busloads of very poor people coming from New Orleans, having been completely displaced and lost everything, and just sort of ended up, bus stopped in Houston, there's the door, there you are. And the civic leaders in Houston, and thinking about what to do about this, realized that their homeless system had been doing this rapid rehousing thing, and that this would work for these now newly homeless people. And in fact, the city of Houston, rather than stuck with a giant homelessness problem for the rest of their lives, as many people predicted would happen when those buses showed up, in fact, absorbed people into the community very quickly, got them housed so that homelessness didn't go up in Houston at all. New Orleans has adopted much of the same approach. The homelessness that skyrocketed after the hurricane because of the destruction of housing is now back down below where it was before Hurricane Katrina and dropping quickly. And people in people in New Orleans, who we've worked with very closely, are very excited about the progress they're making because of the exact kind of steps that I was talking about. Homelessness overall across the whole country. I mean, part of this approach was to try to quantify a little better how many homeless people there are in the country. People participate in the local point-in-time counts all over the country, including here. It's coming right up. As a data gathering mechanism, this is not perfect, but I think it does a pretty good job of giving us an idea of where we stand. We saw from the time HUD first started asking communities to do that in 2005 until the start of the recession, we saw actually very steep drop in the number of homeless people because of a lot of these new approaches. The recession hit. We thought a recession like this, we were at the start of the recession, we saw all these economists sort of predicting how high unemployment nationally would go up to 9.8%. And we figured out, well, if unemployment goes up to 9.8%, and we know what the historical relationship between increasing unemployment and homelessness was, the number of homeless people in this country is going to go up a lot during this recession. We even put out a paper that said that. But I'm happy to say we were wrong about that paper. One of the reasons we were wrong is because a lot of people did some things in response to that changed the whole equation. So so that was a good thing. That was what was supposed to happen. But the homelessness did not go up at all during the recession. It went actually down a little bit, which, as I was saying to people last night, keeping something bad from happening is not always something that gets a lot of publicity or gets a lot of notice. But I think people working on this issue around the country deserve huge congratulations for even with all the suffering that the recession caused and all the housing problems people have, we didn't see homelessness going up. And now in the most recent counts, it's starting to go back down again. And again, this is partly because of investments by a whole bunch of different people, including the federal government, including a lot of state and local governments, including a lot of private philanthropy. But it's also because people working on the issue at the local level are improving what they're doing and making big changes along the lines that we just talked about. I'll just have to win from here. So that's where we're at now. That's what communities have done. We talked about some of the communities that have gotten really good results. And I mean really good results, like Denver, for example, if you look at veterans, and now as I've been saying I'm going to talk about veterans, now I'm going to talk about veterans. Denver in their 2013 point-in-time count reduced the number of homeless veterans in Denver, which is a big city with a lot of homeless veterans. Over a 2-year period, they reduced that by about 2/3 by taking the approach that I just talked about. Veterans is going to be the vanguard of this thing. And I know there's, probably a disproportionate number of veterans in northern Wisconsin, and I think it's probably the issue of homelessness among veterans is bad here as it is everywhere, and troubling here as it is everywhere. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs has had homelessness programs for a long time. The thing about managing the problem instead of solving the problem, that would pretty much define what their approach had been for a long time. They have now seen what some communities have done, and they have taken it upon themselves in the national VA to say, we just can't have this. Homelessness among veterans, it just has to stop. The guy, the long-term career general who is now the head of the Department of Veterans Affairs has made this a very personal thing. Doesn't get a lot of publicity, but really the VA has changed their homeless system from that kind of system of managing, not ending that I was talking about before, to one that very much matches the best practices we're talking about. So they have the people who are familiar with this, I'll get a little technical here for a minute, they have this HUD-VASH program, which is a deep rent subsidy, a Section 8 subsidy for people who are familiar with that, combined with case management from the VA that's really concentrated on helping veterans get access, helping homeless veterans get access to VA kind of mental health, addiction treatment services, so they have that full range of services that they need. And it's ending chronic homelessness among veterans. I mean, we've already seen places that have announced that there are no more chronically homeless veterans. Utah is not a liberal state, in case anybody was wondering about that. Utah has ended chronic homelessness among veterans. There are no more veterans with disabilities who've been homeless for more than a year now, which is you know, I read that headline, I still get emotional about it. It's a good thing to see. And as I said, Denver reduced the number of homeless veterans by 2/3 in 2 years by adopting this range of approaches. Because of decisions by Congress, there's a lot of very bipartisan support for the issue of veterans homelessness. The program called the SSVF program, which not many people have heard of, yes, write it down. This is the source of funding for rapid rehousing programs for homeless veterans. It's grants to nonprofits. Every area in the country is covered. So somebody has the SSVF grant to cover this community. Anybody know who it is? Raise your hand if you know who has the SSVF. No? Oh, yeah, all right, good deal. You have it? Okay, the guy in the back. Talk to him if you have homeless veterans. This is going to make a huge difference. This program, and the program's been around for a few years, but funding was just tripled to the point where we now look at it and say, we look at the number of homeless veterans in the country, and we look at the amount of money in this program, and we look at the kind of cost-effective results that well-run rapid rehousing programs get. And we say there's no reason we can't bring the number of homeless veterans down, you know, very close to zero by the end of 2015, which was what the VA secretary has set as his goal. And it's going to take a lot of work because there's still, you know, this community level work that we've been talking about still needs to be done to make sure these resources are coordinated and that they're assigned in the right way, that the right veterans get the right kind of help that's going to work for them without, you know, spending more money than you need and thereby leaving other veterans out in the cold. So veterans is going to be the vanguard in this. I think over the next few years we're going to see people who thought ending homelessness was just sort of a ridiculous thing and how could you possibly talk about that, are going to look at what's happening with veterans and saying, wow, they're really doing that. And if we can do that for veterans, you know, everybody agrees, the thing about veterans, everybody agrees no veterans deserve to be homeless. I'm pretty sure almost everybody agrees on that. But when you really think about it, I mean, the people we talk about, do little kids, age 0 to 1, do they deserve to be homeless? You know, people are going to be wondering the same thing. We could get the same results for them. Are people with chronic, long-term mental illness, do they deserve to be homeless? They didn't ask to have schizophrenia, believe me. And we know that we have programs that work for them. And in fact, you know, I think there's a lot of agreement, really, when it comes to homelessness, really nobody deserves that. No American deserves to be homeless. America does not deserve to have a homeless problem. We have now the solutions at hand. We need to do it. So it is happening. It's happening because of people like you all over the country who are concerned about this at the local level and are finding out what's going to work, what's going to make this happen, and are making it happen locally. So thank you all for coming out today. Use our website, get in contact with me. Other questions that come up as this process unfolds, please use the National Alliance to End Homelessness as a resource. Thanks again to Congressman Duffy and his staff for having me out here, and have a great day. I do have time for questions if people want to ask a couple of questions. Let's go, yes.
Where do we get the data for our communities on
On what?
the number of homeless?
Where do we get the data on the number of homeless? Ask this person right here, right?
The state of Wisconsin, at this point in time, works with the providers in the community, and we, through all of their resources, count the number of individuals. And so I'll be talking about that in just a few moments, about the numbers in this particular area.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
In the 80s, The institutionalization movement, what extent is that effective?
The question was the deinstitutionalization moment, people with mental illness. The sort of standard treatment before that was big state hospitals, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, everybody's seen that movie. And yeah, I mean, over a 40-year period, there was a move away from big state institutions, partly because they were attacked as being not humane, partly because they cost a lot of money. I think the idea among mental health advocates was those would be replaced by a system of community-based treatment and support for people with mental illness so they can live in the community. A lot of states, I think, thought that even a way to save even more money than by doing that was to close the state hospitals and not provide the community-based treatments and supports. Now, they turned out to not be right. The research I talked about before, it turns out that actually it's more expensive to keep a homeless person, to have a homeless person with a mental illness live on the streets than it is to provide them with community-based services. And so the support, I really see the supportive housing intervention that I talked about as really being finally coming back and saying, okay, we made a mistake, so these are that community-based set of services and supports. And I think it's going way beyond chronically homeless people. I think people are seeing the benefit of this and providing it more and more. So yeah, I think that was, we sort of took a wrong turn there, I think. And I think we're part of what this ending homelessness thing is about fixing that wrong decision that we made a long time ago. Yes?
I think one area I'd like to see addressed is dealing with people who are of a mindset. They have a spirit of poverty, and they've lived this way, kind of on the fringes, pretty much all their lives, generationally, so that these same people produce kids who live like this, who are just on the edge, who are coming to use the Department of Health and Human Services, who are taking advantage of monies but never changing anything about the way they live. And so they're producing children then who are going to do the same thing. And we're seeing these kids in school who are the troublemakers, and it goes on and on. That's one area that I think that needs to be focused on, and I don't know exactly what that would look like.
Yeah, and this is a difficult problem for a lot of people. I would say, one of the nice things about working on homelessness is that among the people experiencing it too, you don't, when people get to the point of being homeless, that actually turns out to be, that's it for them. They don't want to do that anymore. Not always, but in many, many cases. Now there's another thing, and remember we're talking about people with mental health problems, and there's a lot of that going on. And I think a lot of providers, if they approach this issue, it's like, they know they've got to market this to clients. The community wants people not living on the street. It's not just for them, it's for the rest of the community too. So in some sense, there's some marketing that has to be done. If people approach it in that spirit, a lot of times, homeless people don't want help is what we hear, but it turns out that what they don't want is what you're offering them. But if you offer them something else, and if you listen very carefully to them, and sometimes listening very carefully requires some specialty help, because if you're dealing with people with mental illness, they will communicate their desires in sort of ways that the rest of us probably can't understand without specific training. But if you listen carefully to them and provide them sort of step by step with what they say they want, this turns out to be a very good guide to making effective choices. People who did permanent supportive housing and made that work. I mean, I think if they want to work, whether you should have to do that or whether it's the right thing to do, people disagree about that. But the fact that that's what works, that's really beyond dispute at this point. Yes?
600,000 people are released from prison each year. And at least half of those, and actually that number is low, at least half of those become homeless. Mm-hmm. And then we spend $47 billion roughly on the criminal justice system. And we're spending that money so that we can create homeless people. Because what happens is, you know, you're convicted of a crime, you lose your apartment, and you might be convicted of something where you're gonna go to jail for 3 or 4 months, and you still lose your apartment. You come out, no job, no place to stay. And so, how do we reform the criminal justice system with the issue of saving money? Because each of those people costs at least 50 grand a year, at least.
Yeah, this is really true. The question, if people couldn't hear, was about sort of the effect of people coming out of prison and how that affects homelessness. A lot of people coming out of prison become homeless. That's beyond dispute. The other thing is, people who come out of prison and become homeless are much, much more likely to commit another crime and go back to prison than people who come out of prison and have a stable place to live. I mean, much more, like 20 times more likely, some studies have shown. I mean, this is, it's like, if somebody running a prison discharges somebody to homelessness, they are, it's like they're ensuring that more crime will be committed and that they will spend more money. When I talk about people that get involved in this work on ending homelessness, the people running corrections have to be part of this. There are things that, there are program models for reentry that have proven to work. There's federal money that flows to the states under a thing called the Second Chance Act, which is a very bipartisan piece of legislation. I mean, very bipartisan. Very conservative members of Congress are behind the Second Chance Act, as well as more liberal members. It really spans the whole field. So there's money available there, not as much as there needs to be, but it's something. You know, I would say find out who in the state is getting the Second Chance Act funding and how they can, how you can get involved, because they're required to have a very collaborative process for figuring that out. And then, you know, the point of that is it saves a lot of money for state correction systems. Those systems should be interested in doing more. But it's definitely a group we're doing it. In the back.
Yeah, we're talking about veterans and our concern about veterans. But what I would like to say is that unless we change our foreign policy in this country, we are not going to do anything but make the situation worse. Let's face it, people, the American empire is over. We can no longer afford to be the world's policeman. We can no longer afford to pump money into all of these conflicts. What have we gotten out of Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, go back? So it's time to bring the troops home. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican, but I am a supporter of Congressman Ron Paul and what he did to try to bring sanity to the foreign policy of our country.
All right, thank you. Thanks.
I had a question. Do you have any background insights related to community land trusts or community housing trusts that have been successful in communities around the country?
You know, I wouldn't say I'm an expert in community land trusts. I know that it's a model that a lot of places have used and done some good stuff with affordable housing there. But, you know, I would suggest there's a couple other national groups. There's a National Low-Income Housing Coalition and the Center for Community Change are two places that know more than I would about about those kind of models. Okay, one more question, right in the middle.
Yeah, considering once the homeless are put in and rapidly housed, then the other problems still exist sometimes, the mental health issues, other types of issues, job issues, how to get a job and so on. Can you suggest a model program that would work in communities like Rhinelander or Wausau or Marshfield or Stevens Point, not Omaha or New Orleans or wherever, that would work in our smaller communities?
Yeah, so, I mean, just the point to make there, you know, the one thing about what I'm talking about in ending homelessness is about focusing on that. I mean, all you're doing is ending homelessness. That's a very important thing, as I think, but there's still going to be other problems related to poverty, mental illness, everything else that remains to be solved. The people experiencing those problems will be more effective participants in the solution if they're housed. I can guarantee you of that. But it's not like the community's troubles are done. So I don't have a specific model to develop, because that, once we get beyond homelessness, it's sort of beyond my area of expertise, but I do end up knowing a little bit about that. So let me, if somebody can email me with that question, I'll check it out when I get back to the office, and we'll come up with some ideas. Because I think there's a lot of places that have large rural populations that have made some substantial progress. I know, like Ohio, they feel very good about the way their mental health system works outside of the big cities. I don't know much about it beyond that, but I know there are places that feel like they're solving that problem, so let's work on it. That's got to be it. I'll be around the rest of the day, so feel free to approach me if I can do anything for you. And again, I encourage you to, figure out ways the National Alliance to End Homelessness can help you with this. Call on me, use our website, use our social media to get in touch with us. And good luck with the rest of the day.